Hey guys, tonight let's slip yourself into the stiff, rustling layers of a Victorian gown. And before you even reach for your cup of tea, someone is tugging a corset's laces tighter, tighter still, until your ribs feel like they've signed a peace treaty with your lungs and agreed to only use half their space. You stand there, smiling serenely, because apparently fainting gracefully is a social skill, and shortness of breath is simply the price you pay for good posture. You probably won't survive this, at least not without developing a strange intimacy with your fainting couch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The corset digs into your sides with the determination of an overzealous boa constrictor that has a strong opinion about your waistline. You can feel the stays, those rigid strips of whalebone or steel, pressing in, coaxing your spine into a position it never auditioned for. The maid steps back to admire her work, and you suspect she's either an artist or a minor villain, depending on how much air you can currently pull in. In the mirror, your waist appears impossibly small, like you've been drawn by a cartoonist with a vendetta against internal organs. Historians still argue whether Victorian women truly wore their corsets as tightly as fashion plates suggested, or if the whole thing was more symbolic, loosened a notch or two in private. But the fact remains, even a moderately snug corset reshaped your body, nudged your ribs inward, and encouraged an elegant, upright stance. You try to inhale, and it comes out more like a cautious sip of air. Breathing deeply, that's for the morally lax. Instead, you cultivate the genteel rise and fall of your shoulders, which doubles as both modesty and necessity. It's no wonder women sometimes carried small vials of smelling salts, tiny bottles of ammonia-laced rescue, for when good posture tipped over into unconsciousness, your movements become deliberate. You don't bend at the waist. That's impossible without structural failure. You hinge from the hips, like a well-trained marionette, lowering yourself onto chairs with the grace of someone who has been trained since childhood not to unspool in public. Every gesture feels rehearsed, because it is. And then there's the breathing practice part. No, not yoga, not mindful meditation. This is the art of regulating your oxygen intake while wearing what is essentially Victorian shapewear from the underworld. Walking becomes an exercise in pacing. You stride too quickly, and you risk dizziness. You move too slowly, and you appear languid, which can be read as either alluring or lazy, depending on the gossiper. One mainstream historical fact you'd be hard-pressed to ignore. Corsets weren't just about fashion. They were seen as healthful in the era's warped logic. The belief was that proper posture supported by a corset could improve digestion, prevent drooping shoulders, and even aid in fertility. Meanwhile, modern historians and doctors look at the skeletal remains from the period and point out the telltale compressed ribcage. But here's a quirkier tidbit. Some women reportedly used corsets as a sort of resistance training, deliberately tightening them a little more each week to train the waist. A slow, methodical campaign against one's own circumference. Occasionally, the extremes became literal sideshow material. Women with reported 13-inch waists toured in exhibitions, claiming to be living proof of the perfect figure. Historians still argue whether those figures were exaggerated, or if extreme tight lacing was a fringe but real subculture. You try to imagine the daily routine: waking, dressing, then allowing someone else, never yourself, to cinch you in. Feeling the gentle give of fabric turning into the unyielding command of whalebone. And then stepping out into a world where your very breath is rationed by fashion, where an uncontrolled gasp could be mistaken for melodrama. The kind of life where a sneeze must be carefully negotiated with your own body in advance. Somewhere in the room, a clock ticks. Each tick is an invitation to notice your pulse, the soft thud of your heart against the confined space inside you. You shift your weight, feeling the fabric layers sway like a bell's pendulum. Your hands rest lightly at your sides, not because it's comfortable, but because moving them higher might pull the bodice awkwardly. And you realize something. You are learning to breathe not as a human, but as a decorative creature designed to move in measured, artful ways. The corset is no longer just a garment. It's a social contract. You keep your figure small, your movements precise, your presence ornamental, and in return, society agrees to call you elegant. The room is warm, and your ribs are still politely protesting from the corset when a lady presses something into your hand, slender, painted, and made of delicate sticks and fabric. It's a fan. Not the cheap folding thing you buy at a tourist shop, but a miniature work of art, lace-edged and smelling faintly of lavender. You think it's just for cooling yourself, maybe fluttering it dramatically when the conversation gets too dull. You'd be wrong. The moment you hold it, you've inherited an entire covert communication system. In Victorian society, fans weren't just accessories. They were conversational weapons. You could flirt, refuse, encourage, or scandalize without a single word. The real trick: everyone pretended it was subtle. You look down at the fan's painted surface. It's pastoral, shepherdesses with questionable hygiene and sheep that look oddly smug. But this is no rustic daydream. It's camouflage for your real intent. With the right gesture, you can tell the tall gentleman across the room that yes, you'd like him to call on you tomorrow. Or no, he should absolutely never try to sit near you again. Historians still argue whether there truly was a universally understood language of the fan, or if the whole idea was a romanticized invention by etiquette guides and clever advertisers. But enough manuals survive, little booklets filled with coded gestures, that you begin to suspect there was at least a kernel of truth. And in a world where propriety demanded that conversation between unmarried men and women be supervised, a fan became a loophole. You try it, Fan slowly, and you're saying, I am married. Snap it shut quickly. Asterisk, leave me alone. Let it rest against your cheek. Asterisk, yes. I'd like to meet you. Drop it, well, that's a cry for help, socially speaking. Someone should pick it up, and in doing so, acknowledge your silent distress. A mainstream fact here is that fans were considered essential for a well-dressed woman, much like gloves or a hat. They were part of the necessary trifecta of public appearance, not optional. A lady without a fan was like a modern host without Wi-Fi, unprepared for polite society. The quirkier detail. Some women practiced in front of mirrors, the way an actor rehearses lines. They'd perfect the exact angle of a half-hide behind the fan, or the languid flick open that suggested confidence without arrogance. A misjudged movement could send the wrong message entirely. Imagine accidentally telling someone you're secretly engaged when you were just trying to swat a moth. So here you are, sitting rigidly upright, gloved fingers curling delicately around your new tool of social maneuvering. The room feels stifling, but you resist the urge to use the fan for its original, practical purpose, cooling yourself. That would make you look flustered, and flustered is practically a character flaw. A gentleman approaches. You know his name, everyone does, but he's not quite the person you want to spend the rest of the evening with. You angle the fan against your left cheek, ever so slightly. If he knows the code, he'll understand. If he does, well, then you just look like you're thinking about mutton. As the evening continues, you notice others at work. Two girls in pale gowns have their fans open and are tapping the tips of their noses, supposedly. That's an invitation to follow me, asterisk. Across the room, a widow in jet black silk fans herself slowly and evenly, radiating the message. Don't try it. I've buried 2 husbands. You realize the beauty of it, the plausible deniability. Every motion can be passed off as idle, every signal as a simple twitch of the wrist. It's like speaking in code while pretending you barely speak at all. And as you stand there, corset-laced and fan-poised, you understand the real skill Victorian women mastered, controlling not just what they said, but how they appeared to say it. Even your silence is curated, your stillness a performance. The fan just gives you a stage. The party shifts, and the air now smells faintly of beeswax polish and too many bodies in one drawing room. Someone, your hostess, glides past with a smile that could curdle milk if you looked too closely. She's scanning for one thing, whether you're wearing gloves. And you are. You wouldn't dare not. They're soft kid leather, pale enough to suggest you don't actually do any work with your hands, but thin enough to allow the sensation of everything you touch, which, at the moment, is a delicate teacup, its heat seeping faintly through the fabric. Gloves are more than a fashion accessory. They are a social buffer. They're a handshake filter, a skin shield, and an outward sign of your inner moral hygiene. A mainstream historical fact. Victorian etiquette books insisted a lady wear gloves outdoors, at social calls, and even at some indoor events. To be seen with bare hands in public, unless eating, playing the piano, or tending to a very delicate embroidery, was to risk appearing common. The gloves said, "I am refined, I am proper, and my fingertips are not for casual viewing." But here's the quirkier reality. Glove etiquette had its own rulebook. Removing your gloves at the wrong moment could trigger gossip faster than tripping over the tea tray. For instance, to take off your gloves during a dance was fine. You couldn't exactly waltz without skin contact. But to do so before being properly introduced to your partner, scandal. Removing gloves at the dinner table, absolutely forbidden, unless you wanted to be known as that daring woman for the rest of the season. Historians still argue whether glove rules were truly enforced at all levels of society, or whether the strictest codes were mainly the obsession of the wealthy elite. In the industrial cities, practicality often won over propriety, but in genteel circles, the gloves might as well have been legal documents. And naturally, there was the matter of how you removed them. One did not simply peel off gloves like a modern commuter freeing themselves from mittens. No, you were expected to tug gently at each fingertip in turn, letting the glove loosen slowly, as if your fingers were precious objects being unwrapped. Done too quickly, it was crude done too slowly, and it edged into a kind of unseemly intimacy that made onlookers blush. You find yourself seated beside a tall, angular man with a mustache so carefully waxed it looks like a punctuation mark. He notices your gloves. His gaze lingers, not on your face, but on the way your fingers curl around your teacup. It dawns on you that, in this room, your gloves are a conversation before you even open your mouth. They're saying, "I am worth approaching," but not without the right introductions. Some women reportedly kept several pairs on them during long social days, switching to a fresh set after traveling between calls. Gloves were that personal. Imagine carrying spares the way modern people carry phone chargers. And yet, like so many Victorian rules, there's a trap hidden inside. What happens if you spill tea on them? Do you dab discreetly and keep wearing them, risking a slow, sticky discomfort? Or do you remove them in plain view, risking the scandal of bare hands before dessert? You remember the stories, how one poor woman supposedly sparked an entire week's worth of gossip by pulling off her right glove to retrieve a dropped spoon. By the time the tale reached its third retelling, she'd practically proposed marriage to the man seated beside her. You glance down now and adjust the stitching at your wrist. The button is tiny, fiddly, and requires the same patience as threading a needle. No wonder ladies often needed help fastening them, a quiet intimacy that, if performed by the wrong person, could set tongues wagging. So you keep your gloves on, even though the room is stifling, and your palms are beginning to feel like they're trapped inside a very polite oven. You smile, sip your tea through the faint taste of leather, and remind yourself, every stitch, every seam is part of the costume. And in this theater of manners, the smallest prop can decide the whole scene. Your gloves are still on, the corset still hugging you with stubborn loyalty when the call comes. It's time for tea. Not the casual, half-distracted sort you might gulp while scrolling on your phone. This is capital T, the ritual. You follow the murmured tide of voices into the dining room, where the table is already set with a porcelain army of teacups, saucers, silver spoons, and a pot that gleams like it was polished by moonlight itself. The hostess is stationed at the head, ready to pour. But before you even reach the table, you feel the eyes of the room checking. Are you aware of the rules? Do you know that tea pouring is not just a mechanical act, but a test of social competence? A mainstream historical fact. In Victorian etiquette, tea was more than a beverage, it was a social performance. The woman pouring it held a position of temporary power, controlling the flow of conversation and hospitality. She decided whose cup was filled first, who received the delicate china versus the sturdier kind, and how much milk to add before the tea. You sit, careful to adjust your skirts so they don't crush like an accordion beneath you. The tea arrives in front of you, the surface shimmering faintly. But here's the catch. Sometimes you might be expected to pour. And that means entering the unspoken battlefield of tea etiquette. The pot itself is deceptively heavy, and you must lift it with just enough tilt to produce a smooth stream, never a splash. You must not overfill. Spilling into the saucer is a mark of doom, as if you've just confessed to chewing with your mouth open. Milk, if used, must be added after the tea, unless you're one of those controversial milk-first households. Historians still argue whether that was ever truly wrong or just a class marker. Sugar, if offered, must be passed with tongs, never fingers. The quirky tidbit. Some households trained young women on a specific tea pour angle, using water in a practice pot, timing their pours like a drill. A perfect pour should be steady enough that the tea made no glugging sound. Yes, even the noise of liquid could be deemed vulgar if too enthusiastic. The conversation continues around you, but you can't help focusing on your hands, the weight of the porcelain, the imagined horror of dripping tea onto someone's sleeve. And then there's the distribution order, always elders first, then guests of highest rank, then the rest in descending social order, as though the tea itself were trickling down through the hierarchy. A young man across from you, barely out of university, asks if you take sugar. You pause, because your answer is also a performance. 2 lumps might suggest indulgence. 1 lump is restrained, but still agreeable, none at all. That could be read as aloof or health conscious, depending on your company. This is the part they don't tell you in cookbooks. The etiquette isn't just about what you do but about what other people think you meant by doing it. And the spoons. You never leave them in the cup, never, lest you accidentally fling tea at a neighbor. Stir gently, without tapping the sides, because the asterisk tink 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 asterisk of spoon on porcelain is the audio equivalent of chewing into a microphone. When you finish stirring, you place the spoon neatly on the saucer, angled slightly toward the right. Why? Because it's neater. No one can actually explain this rule without resorting to vague words like graceful or refined. But everyone enforces it. You sip, not too quickly, or it looks desperate, not too slowly, or the tea goes cold and implies you didn't like it. The temperature is perfect because, of course, in this setting, even the tea understands its place. You glance around the table and realize the tea ritual isn't about tea at all. It's about the unspoken choreography of manners, how everyone moves, passes, nods, and smiles in a kind of collective performance. One spill, one clumsy pour, and the spell is broken. You lower your cup, hands steady, smile fixed, and think, at least I haven't dropped a spoon yet. You step outside after tea, grateful for the air, only to be intercepted by a maid who places something curved and delicate into your hand. A parasol, though here they might call it a sunshade. Its silk canopy is stretched tight over spindly ribs, its handle carved with a flourish. It's light, but it carries a weight all the same, not physical, but social, a mainstream historical fact. In the Victorian era, parasols were not just for keeping the sun off your skin, they were for keeping the idea of sun off your skin. Pale complexions were a visible sign of wealth, proof you didn't have to toil outdoors. Owning a parasol was like wearing a badge of exemption from hard labor. You stroll along the gravel path, careful not to twirl the parasol too wildly. Twirling is fine in private gardens, but in public, it risks looking flippant. And flippancy is only charming if you're a child or a wealthy eccentric. Everyone else should behave like a painting, come to life. But here's the quirky twist. Parasols doubled as subtle social signals. The way you carried it, resting against the shoulder, tipped forward, held low, could suggest mood, availability, or even mild defiance. Historians still argue whether these codes were genuinely understood or just imagined by later writers. But period illustrations show women wielding them with a precision that suggests something more than shade-seeking. You tilt it slightly, and the world changes. The sunlight filters through silk in a soft haze, turning the garden into a dream. The gravel crunches under your boots, and every so often, you angle the parasol just enough to glimpse another walker without seeming to stare. The thing acts like a privacy shield, a movable wall between you and whoever might be trying to read your expression. In crowded streets, parasols were also weapons of status. Not in the literal sense, though one could certainly fend off a too eager acquaintance with a brisk pivot, but as spatial tools. You claim a bubble of air around you, discouraging strangers from pressing too close. A plain parasol might suggest practicality. One trimmed in lace and fringe implies a level of decorative luxury that says, yes, I have time to fuss over such things. And of course, parasols had their own care rules. You never left them open indoors. It was bad luck, but also impractical. And some swore it was ill-mannered. You also didn't hand yours to just anyone. Letting a man hold your parasol could be oddly intimate, like letting him fasten your glove buttons. Walking in the park, you spot two women ahead of you. One tilts her parasol low as a gentleman approaches, her face hidden, her body angled slightly away. It's a maneuver that says, "Not today, sir." The other lifts hers entirely, letting the sun fall across her face, a calculated break from the rules, perhaps meant to catch attention. You wonder which of them will be the subject of tomorrow's whispered conversations. The sun is warm, but your skin remains cool under the parasol's shadow. You adjust your pace to match its gentle sway, feeling almost like you're moving under your own private cloud. Every so often, you catch the faint scent of the silk, a reminder that this is more than fabric. It's part of a costume that tells the world exactly who you are, or at least who you're trying to be. And so you walk, corset holding you upright, gloves protecting your hands, parasol casting its polite shade, each object a line in the silent language of Victorian life. The parasol folds neatly with a soft click as you step back indoors. But before you can decide whether to find another cup of tea or escape to a quieter corner, a footman appears with a silver tray. On it, a neat stack of little rectangles, each one thick, embossed, and carrying a name in precise copperplate script. Calling cards. In the Victorian world, these aren't just pieces of card stock, they're social passports. Without them, you can't properly visit, introduce yourself, or acknowledge someone's presence. A mainstream historical fact. Calling cards were indispensable in middle and upper class life. They acted as your public identity, announcing your visit when you arrived at someone's home. If the person was not at home, a polite fiction for "I don't want to see you," the servant would take your card, and your duty was fulfilled. You're handed a small stack of your own, edges crisp enough to slice through paper. They smell faintly of the press ink. Each bears your name in a fine, looping hand. No first name if you're married, because your identity is now essentially your husband's surname, with a Mrs. attached. The very lettering has to be perfect, too ornate, and it looks pretentious, too plain, and it suggests a lack of refinement. Here's the quirky part. The way you folded or marked a calling card could send an additional message. A turned-down corner might mean you visited in person rather than sending a servant. A card left in an envelope could signal a condolence call. One slipped into a card tray with the top edge bent. That could mean you came in person, but didn't expect to be received. Historians still argue whether these codes were consistent across Britain, or if every town had its own interpretations. But the real battlefield of calling cards wasn't in the visit, it was in the snubs. The social warfare of the period could be fought entirely on the playing field of who left cards for whom, and who very deliberately did not. A missing card could launch a rivalry lasting years. A card returned in its own envelope was a clear declaration. We are done here. You find yourself at a small writing desk, pen in hand, considering the politics of the thing. Visiting hours are narrow, often just between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. And to arrive outside that window is to risk being accidentally missed. So you send your cards out with precision, making sure to acknowledge certain names and carefully ignore others. There's a pile of received cards in a silver tray on the mantelpiece, an ongoing record of who's calling on the household. You scan them quickly. Some are plain white, others engraved with crests. A few are distinctly expensive, printed on thick, creamy stock that whispers of old money. You spot one name conspicuously absent, a person you've called on twice without return. That absence is louder than any words could be. Later, you overhear two women discussing someone who left her card after the hostess had already made a clear break in the acquaintance. The tone is deliciously scandalized, the kind that draws out syllables. Imagine. After what happened at Lady Pemberton's luncheon, no one specifies what actually happened, but the implication is enough. You slip your remaining cards back into their case, a polished little thing that fits neatly into your reticule, and feel the weight of them. They're just bits of paper, yes, but in this world, they can open doors or close them forever. You've just survived the calling card exchange when the real test of the evening arrives. You're to be escorted to the conservatory with a chaperone. Not just any chaperone, but Mrs. Whiteley, an older woman whose talent for silent disapproval is so honed it could probably be patented. In the Victorian world, an unmarried woman almost never met a man alone. A mainstream historical fact. Social propriety demanded that young ladies be accompanied by an older, respectable woman during outings, walks, and even casual conversations with men. The theory was protection, both from unwanted advances and from any appearance of impropriety. In practice, it meant living under near constant surveillance. Mrs. Whiteley trails just far enough behind to give you the illusion of freedom, but you know she can hear every word you exchange. You greet your companion for the stroll, a polite young man with perfectly combed hair and the slightly anxious look of someone aware they're being graded. You start talking about the weather because that's safe. Too safe. You could be discussing cloud formations on the moon for all the emotional impact it has. And here's the quirky truth. Some chaperones were rumored to be too attentive, deliberately inserting themselves into moments to block potential romance. Others, however, were sly matchmakers, giving couples just enough rope to let something spark before stepping in at the exact moment things might cross a line. Historians still argue whether the majority were guardians of morality or quiet facilitators of strategic courtships. Mrs. Whiteley, unfortunately, is clearly in the first camp. You can feel her gaze boring into your back whenever you lean even slightly toward your companion. You try to glance at him, just a quick flicker of the eyes, but she clears her throat from 10 feet away. The sound is small, but it might as well be a cannon. The conversation limps along. He asks if you've been to the botanical gardens. You say yes. He says they're lovely. You agree. And just as you're about to attempt something more personal, perhaps a joke, about the ridiculous hat on the marble statue, Mrs. Whiteley steps forward to point out a fern. You both look at it dutifully, as though the plant has just been knighted. There's a peculiar kind of skill required to navigate this. You learn to speak in codes, to hide meaning in innocuous topics. A sentence about the number of blooms in the garden becomes an admission of how often you've thought about the other person. A mention of the weather turns into an inside joke. The chaperone can't object to talking about flowers and rain, but you and your companion know there's more underneath. You've heard of couples who managed entire courtships this way. Their words like the tip of an iceberg, 90% of the meaning hidden from view. Sometimes the chaperone guessed, sometimes not. The trick was never letting the performance falter. When the walk ends, Mrs. Whiteley escorts you back to the drawing room, her face unreadable. You thank her politely, because that, too, is expected, and she nods in return. The man gives you a parting bow, and the moment he's out of earshot, she remarks, quite proper. No cause for concern, which, in this world, is both a compliment and a reminder that she intends to keep it that way. The next afternoon, you're in the park. The sky is politely overcast, the Victorian ideal, really, and the path curves between rows of clipped hedges. You're here for what should be the simplest thing in the world, a walk. And yet, even here, rules lurk like potholes in the gravel, a mainstream historical fact. Respectable women in the Victorian era were expected to walk at a measured, almost ceremonial pace. Walking too quickly risked looking hurried or unladylike. Walking too slowly suggested either poor health or affectation. The right pace was somewhere in the middle, and yes, people noticed. You've brought your parasol again, but today's focus is not the shade, it's the rhythm of your steps. Your companion, another lady, matches your pace. You talk quietly, pausing every so often to admire a flower bed, which doubles as a way to avoid overtaking anyone. To overtake another walker without a polite greeting can look like a social slight, especially if the person is of equal or higher standing. Here's the quirky twist. Even the act of where you walked mattered. Certain promenades and paths in parks were unofficially ranked. The most fashionable route, often the one closest to the main street or bandstand, was reserved for those wishing to be seen. Lesser routes were for quieter company or those avoiding certain acquaintances. Historians still argue whether the wrong path could actually harm your reputation, but enough period diaries mention strategic route choices to make you suspicious. And then there's the walking stick. You don't carry one yourself, those were more common for men, but you notice several gentlemen using them not for balance, but as part of their strides choreography. A man who tapped his stick lightly against the gravel, every few steps appeared casual. One who swung it widely risked drawing attention. If a gentleman offered you his arm for support, you had to decide quickly. Accepting could look intimate, rejecting could seem cold. The forbidden pace is always in the back of your mind. If you walk too briskly with a man, It suggests an unusual level of familiarity. After all, you'd have to match his stride, which can appear eager, too slow, and it implies languor or even flirtation, as though you're savoring every moment together. You and your companion round a bend and spot a pair ahead. A young woman and a gentleman, clearly trying to look casual while failing miserably. They're walking just a fraction too fast for propriety, the distance between them shrinking in tiny increments. Behind them, an older woman, the inevitable chaperone, is already increasing her pace to catch up, like a moral metronome set to a higher tempo. Your own pace remains perfect, steady, deliberate. You feel almost as if you're part of a slow-moving parade, each passerby a performer in the silent play of appearances. A bow here, a nod there. The sound of boots and skirts brushing gravel is constant, punctuated by the occasional polite cough or the faint clink of a gentleman's watch chain. The strangest thing, it's oddly restful. The rhythm of it all, the predictability, the way the rules keep everyone moving in harmony. It's as though the city has decided that walking itself is a kind of public waltz, and you're one of the dancers. The walk ends at a polite hour, and you find yourself in a drawing room again, this time one with high ceilings, heavy drapes, and enough mirrors to make you constantly aware of your own posture. You're seated with a small group, chatting over tea and biscuits, when the conversation shifts to something far more dangerous than politics or religion. Glances, a mainstream historical fact. In Victorian etiquette, eye contact between unmarried men and women was heavily policed, at least in polite society. A steady gaze could be interpreted as flirtation, and flirtation outside the proper channels was risky business. The ideal look was brief, just enough to show attention without crossing into impropriety. You're speaking to a gentleman now, and you find yourself performing the delicate art of asterisk, almost looking asterisk. Your eyes meet his for a heartbeat before you glance away, as though you've just remembered something terribly important about the wallpaper. You let your gaze return only when he's speaking again. It's a balancing act. Too much eye contact, and you look forward too little, and you seem cold. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some etiquette manuals offered almost comically precise guidelines for acceptable glances. They advised that a young lady should not meet a gentleman's gaze for more than 3 seconds at a time, unless in the presence of her parents. Historians still argue whether these prescriptions were widely followed or were the anxious inventions of middle-class moralists. But the fact remains your eyes are as monitored as your words. There's also the matter of who asterisk you look at. To lock eyes with a stranger in the street could be seen as an invitation, one you might not want to extend. Conversely, refusing to meet the eyes of someone introduced to you could be taken as a deliberate insult. Even in church, glances carried meaning. A sideways look across the pews might set the gossip mill turning before the sermon was over. In this drawing room, the stakes are high because you're surrounded by witnesses. The man across from you tells a mildly amusing story about his uncle's hunting dog, and you allow yourself a longer look, 2 seconds, maybe 3, paired with a polite smile. Immediately, you sense the attention of Mrs. Whiteley. Yes, her again, from across the room. You break the gaze before she can clear her throat. What's strange is how much power a glance seems to have here. It can suggest alliance, interest, dismissal, or boredom. It's the shortest possible sentence in this wordless language, and like all short sentences, it can be devastatingly clear. When the tea things are cleared away, you rise, careful to let your gaze sweep politely across the room, acknowledging those present without lingering. It's an art form, really making every look seem effortless, when in truth, every one has been measured, counted, and tucked neatly into the performance. The chairs in this room are small works of art, mahogany frames with carved details, upholstery patterned in flowers that no real garden could produce. They're beautiful, yes, but they're also traps. Sitting down in the Victorian world is not a matter of simply sitting, a mainstream historical fact. For women in this era, the act of sitting was governed by etiquette as much as speech or dress. You didn't simply drop into a chair, you performed a sequence. Approach, turn, gather your skirts, lower yourself with controlled grace, and finally arrange your clothing so it looked as if you'd been perfectly still all along. The skirt management alone is a sport. You must avoid crumpling the fabric, flashing your ankles, or letting your petticoats puff up around you like a startled hen. Before sitting, you sweep your skirts gently to the back or side, keeping them contained. You move as though lowering yourself onto a nest you've been constructing for days. Here's the quirky twist. Certain chairs were considered inappropriate for women to use at all, especially deep armchairs, or any seat that encouraged sprawling. Those were for men whose trousers made such postures acceptable. Historians still argue whether this was strictly enforced or more of a symbolic restriction. But enough etiquette books warned against lounging to make it clear that casual comfort was a dangerous indulgence, and posture matters. You don't lean back heavily. Instead, you keep your spine upright, shoulders gently back, chin level. If there's a chair with arms, you rest your hands lightly on them without gripping, as though you might rise at any moment. Crossing your legs. Absolutely not, though crossing at the ankles was acceptable, preferably with both feet angled modestly to one side. Today, you find yourself in a particularly tricky seat. A low, delicate chair with a back that offers almost no support. The gentleman opposite you seems entirely at ease, leaning back with one arm draped casually over his chair. Meanwhile, you're holding yourself in place with thigh muscles you didn't know existed, because slouching would be a social misdemeanor. The conversation drifts to music, and you nod and smile while subtly adjusting your skirts so they cascade evenly over the edge of the seat. The trick is to appear utterly comfortable while secretly negotiating an architectural arrangement between body, clothing, and furniture. Then there's the rising. You can't just stand, you must reverse the entire process. Smooth your skirts, place both feet firmly, and rise in a controlled, vertical motion without pushing too hard on the chair arms. A sudden or awkward stand could be read as either impatience or poor upbringing. And so, every time you take a seat in this world, you're not resting, you're performing. The chair isn't just furniture, it's a stage. And you're the perfectly poised leading lady, even if your calves are quietly screaming for mercy. You've been invited to an afternoon tea, and this time, the battlefield is the refreshment table. It's a modest spread, china cups, silver teaspoons, a tiered tray of sandwiches, and cakes. But every single item comes with its own minefield of expectations. A mainstream historical fact. In Victorian etiquette, how you held your teacup and managed your food was considered a reflection of your upbringing. There was a right way to hold the cup by the handle, between thumb and forefinger, with the middle finger lightly supporting underneath. The oft-mocked pinky out wasn't actually proper. It was considered theatrical and gauche. Before you can even sip, there's the matter of pouring. If you're serving, you fill each cup only about 2/3 full anymore, and your guest risks spilling. Sugar is offered first, then milk. Pouring milk first into the cup was considered acceptable in some circles, scandalous in others. Historians still argue whether the milk first method began with the lower classes to prevent delicate china from cracking when hot tea hit it, or if it was simply a regional quirk. Either way, someone will judge you for it. And then there's the food. You eye the sandwiches, crustless, of course, and remember the rule. Never take more than one at a time. Eating is performed in small, discreet bites, no matter how delicious. If you drop crumbs, you ignore them. Brushing them onto the floor would be an unforgivable breach. The quirky tidbit. Some etiquette books warned against speaking at all while holding food, lest you draw attention to your mouth. One even claimed that a lady should not open her mouth wide enough to reveal her back teeth under any asterisk circumstances, which makes you wonder how anyone ate an eclair without breaking the laws of geometry. You take your tea slowly, letting the warm porcelain press gently against your fingers. Across the table, a young woman commits the dreaded stir. She swirls her spoon in a noisy circle, clinking the sides. Proper stirring, you recall, is a quiet back and forth motion, never touching the cup's edge. She doesn't seem to notice, but Mrs. Whiteley, naturally stationed nearby, lowers her eyelids in the slow blink of judgment. Conversation flows in soft ripples, pausing when someone reaches for a scone. You select one with deliberate care, splitting it gently with your fingers, not a knife, and layering jam first, then cream, though you know somewhere, in some distant county, people are already prepared to duel you over the order. Every gesture feels like choreography. The way you set down the spoon, handle resting at 4 o'clock inside the cup. The way you replace your cup on its saucer without looking, trusting the muscle memory. The way you nod to a fellow guest, as though you're both silently acknowledging that yes, this is all completely normal. And no, you are not secretly counting the minutes until you can go home and eat something without witnesses. The tea is finished, but the evening has only begun. And now you're confronted with another test of your social stamina. Conversation. Not the easy, rambling kind you might have with a friend in the kitchen at midnight, but the precise, lace-trimmed variety that flourishes in Victorian drawing rooms. A mainstream historical fact. Small talk in this era wasn't considered shallow. It was a deliberate skill. A lady was expected to keep the conversation pleasant, avoid all topics that might lead to disagreement, and subtly display her education without ever seeming to lecture. That meant steering clear of politics, religion, or anything that hinted at impropriety. Weather, travel, literature, and charitable works were safer harbors. You're perched on the edge of a delicate chair again, facing a gentleman who seems determined to talk about, of all things, railway expansion. You nod politely, adding the occasional indeed, or how interesting, while calculating the safest way to redirect without appearing abrupt. The quirky tidbit. Some etiquette guides suggested memorizing little conversation seeds, short, neutral observations that could be dropped into almost any social moment. These ranged from the roses are quite early this year to I have heard the moon is particularly bright in Italy. Historians still argue whether people truly practiced this kind of verbal stockpilling, or if it was another idealized fantasy cooked up by etiquette authors. Of course, conversation wasn't only about words, it was about delivery. Your tone must be warm, but not too familiar. Your volume low enough to be private, but not so low that people lean in excessively. And you must never, under any circumstances, appear bored. There's a particular rhythm to it. You ask a question, listen with intent, offer a small, agreeable remark, and then hand the topic gently back. This, passing the conversational ball, is an art that, when done well, looks effortless. Done poorly, it either dies in your lap or ricochets awkwardly between you. Tonight, you find yourself exchanging these conversational volleys, while also navigating the subtle cues of exit. A glance toward the mantel clock, a slight shift in your seating position. These are signals that a discussion is reaching its natural conclusion. The gentleman responds by sharing an anecdote about a mutual acquaintance's misadventure with a parasol, and you reward it with a laugh that is warm but not overly enthusiastic. And just as you begin to wonder how much longer you can keep this up, the hostess sweeps by, introducing you to another guest. The conversational landscape changes instantly, and you are back at square one, searching your mental cabinet for another safe and charming opening. The evening rolls on, word by careful word, until you begin to realize that in this world, conversation isn't just a bridge between people. It's a performance, a shield, and at times, a cage. The evening deepens, and now the stakes rise in a different way. You've been invited to a formal dinner. The room glows with lamplight, chandeliers casting warm halos over the polished table. Every fork and knife is laid in a perfect, intimidating row, each glass gleaming like it has been polished by a saint. You take your seat, and immediately you're aware that you've entered a realm where every movement is scrutinized, a mainstream historical fact. Victorian formal dining followed a rigid sequence of courses, each with its own specific utensil. You are expected to work your way from the outside in, starting with the farthest spoon or fork, and moving inward as the meal progressed. Choosing the wrong implement could quietly mark you as unschooled in polite society. Your napkin, folded into an improbable shape, rests on your plate. You know the rule. Place it on your lap as soon as the hostess does. Never before, never after. The napkin isn't for wiping your face. It's for discreetly touching the corners of your mouth. And it should never be twisted into a rope. Or, heaven forbid, used to dab at your nose. The quirky tidbit. Some households trained their servants to watch for guests who salted their food before tasting it, a habit considered an insult to the cook. If you made that mistake, you might find fewer invitations in the future. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just a few particularly proud kitchens taking silent revenge. The meal begins, and the courses come in procession. Soup, fish, meat, game, sweets. Between each, there's careful conversation and measured sips of wine or water, if you prefer to avoid alcohol. The wine glasses vary in size and shape, and heaven help you if you pick up the wrong one. You notice the silent choreography of the table. No one starts eating until the hostess does. No one finishes conspicuously before she does. Bread is broken with fingers, not cut. Soup is sipped from the side of the spoon, tilted away from you. When you set down your utensils between bites, the handles must rest partly on the plate, partly on the tablecloth, angled neatly like clock hands at 20 past 4. And all the while, you must converse lightly, pleasantly, without letting food or drink interrupt the flow. You glance down at your plate, at the delicate slice of pheasant, and realize that while it is certainly edible, the real feast is the social performance happening above the tablecloth. The courses pass in a quiet blur, and when dessert arrives, a molded pudding shimmering under lamplight, you can almost feel the collective relief. Soon, the plates will be cleared, the chairs pushed back, and everyone will retire to the drawing room. But for now, you take a final, careful bite, setting down your fork in the finished position handles together at 4 o'clock, and allow yourself the smallest sigh of triumph. The formal dinner has ended, and the night stretches into its gentlest phase. You find yourself back in the drawing room, the air warmer now from candles and conversation. Chairs are pulled into looser arrangements, the strictness of the table giving way to something that, while still mannered, feels almost human, a mainstream historical fact. After dinner, it was common for the gentlemen to remain at the table for port and cigars, while the ladies withdrew to the drawing room for tea music, or conversation. This separation wasn't just tradition, it reinforced the gendered expectations of the time, where men engaged in political or business talk and women in the refined arts of entertainment and hosting. Here, someone is seated at the pianoforte, coaxing out a waltz at a volume meant to be background rather than performance. Others gather around embroidery hoops or the latest serialized novel, reading aloud in turns. You are drawn into a small group, teacup once again in hand, careful to hold it with the same precision you practiced earlier. The quirky tidbit. In certain circles, it was considered slightly shocking for a woman to play cards after dinner, even though games like whist or cribbage were perfectly respectable during the day. Historians still argue whether this was truly about morality or simply another arbitrary distinction between day and evening behavior. You listen, nod, and offer the occasional laugh in the right places. The conversation is less rigid now, but it still dances around anything too serious. Instead, it lingers on descriptions of dresses seen at last week's ball, the merits of a new embroidery stitch, or the peculiar habits of a mutual acquaintance's cat. Gradually, guests begin to slip away. The hostess thanks each one personally, offering a few words tailored to the visit. You know the final test of etiquette is departure. Leave too early, and you risk seeming ungracious too late, and you impose on your host. When your turn comes, you stand, offer a light curtsy, and murmur your thanks. The door closes softly behind you, and the cool night air meets your face. Walking away, you realize that you've spent the entire evening in a carefully curated performance, one where even relaxation is rehearsed. Yet, in the quiet between footsteps, there's a strange peace to it all. Every bow, every folded napkin, every conversational seed has been part of a shared script, one that kept the night flowing like a slow, deliberate waltz. And now, as the lamps in those imagined drawing rooms dim and the rustle of silk fades into silence, you feel the night itself loosening its collar. The streets are hushed, the last carriage wheels fading into the distance, and somewhere a single window glows faintly before winking dark. You've walked the length of a Victorian evening, from the first careful curtsy to the last polite goodnight, and every moment has been stitched together in fine, deliberate thread. Let your shoulders soften now. The rules, the postures, the perfectly timed nods, all of them can be set aside. You don't need to think about the tilt of your parasol or the precise angle of your fork. You can imagine setting down the teacup for the last time, the faint warmth of it still in your palm, and leaning back into the kind of chair that doesn't demand your spine behave itself. The morning after the ball begins with something far quieter, but no less intricate: the ritual of the calling card. Your gloves are still drying on their porcelain stand when you sit at a small writing desk, preparing for the day's social rounds. A mainstream historical fact: in Victorian society, visiting cards or calling cards were a key tool for managing relationships. Roughly the size of a modern business card, bore your name in elegant script and were presented when calling upon acquaintances. But the rules didn't end at handing one over. The position of the card, the folds, even the corners could send messages more loaded than any spoken sentence. You place your own card into a silver tray by your front door, the equivalent of your public face for the day. When you visit others, you'll place your card in their tray, too, but not always flat. The quirky tidbit, folding down the top right corner, signaled you had delivered the card in person. Folding the top left meant you were saying farewell before a long absence. And the bottom corners, those carried whispers, some say, a folded bottom right was a condolence, while a bottom left could, in certain circles, hint at a flirtation. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were universal or highly regional codes. Your first visit takes you to a neighbor's house. You are received in the parlor, offered tea, and engage in precisely 15 minutes of polite conversation. To stay longer might imply you've nothing better to do, or worse, that you're pressing for deeper intimacy. When you leave, you deposit your card with a practiced flick. Not every call results in a meeting. Often, a servant takes your card, disappears, and returns to say the mistress is not at home. A phrase that rarely meant she was physically absent. It was a polite refusal, one you were expected to accept without question. Later, back at home, you sort through the cards left for you. Each one is a decision. To return the call is to acknowledge and maintain the connection. To ignore it is to quietly let the acquaintance lapse. And so, the trays become silent battlegrounds, filled with names that might fade into dust or bloom into alliances, all depending on how you play this delicate game. You wake to a gray, damp morning, the kind that seems tailor-made for long shadows and slow silences. It feels appropriate, because today you are still in mourning. Not the quiet, private kind, but the public, codified sort that the Victorian world turned into both an art and a science, a mainstream historical fact. In the 19th century, morning dress wasn't merely a personal choice. It was a strict timetable regulated by social expectation. Widows were expected to wear full mourning for up to 2 years, dressed head to toe in matte black crepe, with no jewelry save for jet or onyx. Lighter, half mourning, allowed muted colors like lilac, gray, or mauve, and was gradually introduced before returning to normal dress. The timeline varied depending on the relationship. Parents, children, siblings, even more distant relatives, each had their own prescribed periods. You stand before your wardrobe, the sea of black gowns hanging like a row of silent sentries. Each one is heavy, not just in fabric, but in meaning. The crepe is stiff, scratchy, and absorbs light, as if determined to make you disappear into the background. A quirky tidbit: crepe was notoriously delicate and couldn't be worn in the rain without warping and smelling faintly of mildew, which meant many widows lived in quiet terror of an unexpected shower. Historians still argue whether the elaborate mourning customs were a way to honor the dead, or a social mechanism to control the living, especially women. A widow in deep mourning was expected to avoid parties, music, or any display of joy, effectively removing her from public life for months or years. For some, this meant a welcome retreat. For others, it was a suffocating isolation. When you step outside, you feel eyes on you, not for who you are, but for the exact shade of your attire. Is that lilac ribbon too soon? Has enough time passed to wear lace? The rules are so specific that entire etiquette manuals dedicated chapters to them, warning against indecorous haste, enlightening one's wardrobe. At church, you sit in the same pew as always, but the distance between you and the laughter of other pews feels immense. Someone nods in your direction, the gesture both sympathetic and approving, as if your adherence to the code has been duly noted. You are performing grief, and everyone is watching. By afternoon, you are back home, carefully removing your bonnet so as not to crush the stiff crepe. The black veil leaves a faint line across your forehead. You hang it to air because tomorrow and the day after that you will put it on again. Not because your heart demands it, but because society does. The post arrives with a soft thud on the hall table, and you hear the faint rustle of envelopes being sorted by the maid. In the Victorian world, letters aren't merely a means of communication. They are miniature stages where etiquette performs its most delicate choreography. A mainstream historical fact. Letter writing was considered a crucial social skill, and its etiquette was as regulated as any ballroom dance. The quality of the paper, the neatness of the script, even the way a letter was folded and sealed spoke volumes about the sender. Thick, creamy stationery suggested refinement. A sloppy hand could undermine an otherwise impeccable reputation. And yes, there were rules for ink color. Black was standard, blue was informal, and red was, depending on who you asked, either flirtatious or outright scandalous. You sit at your writing desk, a pot of black ink at your elbow. Outside, the rain is steady enough to make the window glass hum softly. Today's first task is a reply to a dinner invitation. The tone must be warm, but not effusive, accepting without seeming desperate. The quirky tidbit. Even the angle of your pen strokes could be interpreted. Slanting too far to the right was thought to betray excessive emotion, while a rigid vertical hand might seem cold or unfriendly. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were truly widespread beliefs, or just the overzealous readings of etiquette manuals. But either way, the effect was real. People judged your character from the curvature of your capital letters. You compose carefully, letting the ink dry before folding the sheet into thirds. The envelope is addressed in the same hand, and the seal is a small, clean stamp of wax. No grand family crest, just your initials. When you hand it to the maid for posting, you know it will travel across town, be received on a silver salver, and opened in a drawing room where the recipient will likely read it twice before filing it away. Not all letters are formal. Some carry whispered news, coded in phrases meant only for the intended reader. A seemingly mundane comment about the weather improving could, in certain contexts, be a discreet signal of readiness for a visit. And of course, there's the matter of who writes first. Initiating a correspondence could be seen as bold, presumptuous, or flattering, depending entirely on the relationship. By evening, you receive a letter yourself. The paper smells faintly of lavender water, the handwriting precise and flowing. You take it upstairs to read privately, savoring the quiet intimacy of a conversation conducted entirely in ink and paper. In this world, words don't vanish into the air, they linger, folded neatly, waiting to be reread by candlelight. The house is unusually still tonight, save for the low, rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the hall. You're preparing for bed, but in the Victorian world, even the act of retiring for the night follows a subtle choreography of etiquette, a mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, the middle and upper classes viewed the bedroom as a semi-public space. Guests might be shown into it, especially female visitors invited upstairs for private conversation, so it had to be kept orderly and tastefully appointed at all times. The furniture arrangement, the linen quality, and even the placement of your hairbrush on the vanity reflected your refinement. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about the constant performance of respectability. You sit at your dressing table, unpinning your hair. Each pin drops with a tiny metallic note, and your reflection softens as your elaborate daytime coiffure collapses into loose waves. The quirky tidbit. Some etiquette writers of the era claimed a lady should never let her hair be seen fully down by anyone outside her family or her maid, because it was considered an intimate state, almost akin to appearing partially undressed. Historians still argue whether this rule was truly universal or more a projection of prudish ideals. But in polite society, it meant that the ritual of brushing your hair at night was a private, almost sacred moment. You change into a high-necked nightgown of soft cotton, the sleeves buttoned at the wrist. Victorian sleepwear wasn't designed for glamour. It was about modesty, warmth, and a hint of angelic repose. The covers on your bed are turned down in perfect symmetry, a hot water bottle tucked near the foot to warm the sheets. Before getting in, you sit for a moment in the small armchair by the fire, sipping a final cup of warm milk or weak tea, a practice meant to soothe the nerves before sleep. Candles are snuffed one by one, the shadows in the room lengthening until the only light is the faint orange glow from the dying embers in the grate. You slip between the sheets, the faint scent of lavender sachets rising as you settle in. Somewhere outside, a carriage rattles by, but inside, the world has slowed to a hush. In this moment, the day's obligations fade, not gone, only tucked neatly away like folded letters or pressed flowers, ready to be brought out again tomorrow. For now, the only etiquette that matters is to close your eyes, breathe evenly, and surrender to the quiet darkness. You step out into the morning air, the lights still soft, the streets not yet choked with the full bustle of London's clattering carriages and clipped conversation. In the Victorian world, the mere act of walking down the street isn't just a way to get somewhere. It's a performance, a statement, and occasionally a subtle battle for dignity, a mainstream historical fact. Etiquette books of the 19th century offered entire chapters on the correct way for a lady to walk in public. It wasn't about fitness or efficiency. It was about signaling your refinement and self-control with every step. Your pace was to be measured, never hurried, never languid to the point of laziness. The gait must be steady, the stride modest, and the head held high without appearing haughty. Even your eyes had rules. You could glance politely at others, but never stare, and heaven forbid you crane your neck to watch something exciting. You take the first few paces down the pavement, parasol in hand. The quirky tidbit: the side of the pavement you occupied could communicate your social standing. A lady of means was often escorted by a gentleman who walked closest to the road, ostensibly to shield her from splashes. But the reverse could happen if you were with a suitor you weren't yet committed to. Then he might insist you walk nearer the gutter so as not to give the impression of intimacy. That's right. The position of your elbows relative to the cobblestones could be read like a gossip column. Historians still argue whether these spatial rules were universally understood or simply the invention of overly fastidious commentators. But in the more image-conscious neighborhoods, breaking them could earn you a glance sharp enough to slice bread. The street itself presents challenges. There's the constant need to negotiate around slower pedestrians without appearing impatient, to step aside for children or delivery boys without breaking your dignified rhythm, and to avoid catching your skirts on the muddy wheel ruts near shop entrances. That's before you even account for the weather. Rain meant the careful management of both parasol and skirts, ensuring neither dripped nor dragged, while still nodding politely to acquaintances. Your parasol becomes both prop and shield. You angle it not only against the sun, but also as a subtle visual cue, lower and more forward to discourage strangers from approaching, slightly to the side if you're open to greeting an acquaintance. And yes, if you're feeling daring, you can tilt it just enough to make brief, almost clandestine eye contact with someone across the street. This tiny breach of propriety, while frowned upon in manuals, was quietly acknowledged as one of the few socially acceptable ways to flirt outdoors. Every so often, a carriage passes too close, and you must angle your body, lifting your skirt just a few inches above the ankle to keep it from catching in the wheel's splatter. This is the moment where decorum meets practicality, and you have to trust your timing, raise it too high, and you risk impropriety too low, and you'll trail mud into the next drawing room you visit. As you walk, you hear the faint clink of a harness, the distant bark of a dog, the soft chime of a shop bell as a door swings open. These are the small, constant sounds that make up the score of the Victorian street, and each one invites a tiny decision. Slow your pace, nod politely, or cross the road entirely. To navigate it well is to know when to yield and when to hold the line, all without speaking a word. By the time you reach your destination, your posture is still perfect, your expression composed. You've covered less than a mile, but in the eyes of every passerby, you've successfully upheld not just your own dignity, but the invisible architecture of Victorian public life. Walking, after all, isn't merely a way to arrive. It's how you show the world who you are, step by careful step. Your morning calls are finished, and you've returned home with a small, neat stack of visiting cards tucked in your reticule. Before you can even think about luncheon, there's another layer of Victorian etiquette to attend to, one that wraps itself quite literally around your fingers. In this world, your gloves aren't just accessories. They're a language, a barrier, a social filter, and occasionally an unspoken declaration of war, a mainstream historical fact. In the 19th century, gloves were considered essential in almost every public setting. Whether you were attending a ball, strolling through Hyde Park, or simply calling upon a neighbor, bare hands were associated with manual labor, and by implication, a lack of refinement. Soft kid leather gloves were the gold standard, supple enough to mold perfectly to the wearer's hands, their pale cream or dove gray shades signaling that you could afford to keep them immaculate. You stand at your vanity, drawing on a fresh pair. The leather makes a faint, whispering sound as it stretches over your knuckles. The quirky tidbit: some etiquette manuals explicitly warned against putting on gloves in public, claiming it was as inelegant as adjusting one's stockings where others could see. If you absolutely had to, you were advised to turn discreetly toward a wall or screen yourself behind a parasol, as though engaged in some deeply private ritual. Historians still argue whether this prohibition was rigidly followed or simply aspirational nonsense. After all, the unpredictability of weather and social events sometimes made glove removal and replacement inevitable on the go. Still, in the more conservative drawing rooms, such a breach could spark raised eyebrows faster than an overheard scandal. Gloves dictated subtle hierarchies in conversation. At formal dinners, you'd wear them into the room, but remove them once seated to eat, unless you were royalty or a guest of particularly high standing, in which case you might keep them on for the first course as a display of elevated status. At balls, gloves were practically armor. The heat of the room, the friction of dance, the constant pressing of hands, it was all mediated by that fine barrier of leather or silk. Removing them mid-evening could be interpreted as a signal of extreme comfort with your companions or extreme carelessness. Then there's the silent code of glove gestures. This was never fully codified, but social rumor thrived on the idea. A woman might drop one glove deliberately to encourage a gallant to retrieve it, an acceptable way to initiate conversation without appearing forward. Slowly pulling off a glove finger by finger while holding someone's gaze could be a mild flirtation or a subtle assertion of dominance. depending on context, and tucking gloves into your waistband, rather than your reticule, might suggest informality, dangerously close to impropriety if done in the wrong company. For the practical-minded, gloves were also a protection against more than gossip. City streets were filthy, door handles often sticky with whatever the last dozen hands had left behind, and handshakes, though more common among men, were still occasional hazards. The glove provided a sanitary buffer in a world without convenient bottled sanitizer. As the afternoon sun slants through the lace curtains, you sort your gloves for the evening's engagement. Black silk for the theater, pale cream kid for a private dinner, perhaps something with a touch of embroidery for a musicale. You inspect each pair carefully. Wrinkled fingertips suggest overuse. Loose stitching hints at neglect. Maintaining them in perfect condition is its own quiet art. Stretching them gently over porcelain forms, brushing away dust with a soft cloth, even powdering the interior with chalk to absorb moisture. When the hour comes, you draw them on again. They're warm from your touch, but outwardly cool and flawless, hiding every crease and callus. You descend the staircase knowing that before you've spoken a word, these gloves have already told the room 100 small things about you. Your taste, your means, your respect for propriety, and perhaps, for those who know how to look, what little rules you're willing to bend. The evening has deepened into that honey-colored twilight the Victorians so adored, when gas lamps flicker to life one by one, and the carriages grow fewer, their wheels clattering like distant applause on the cobblestones. You're not headed home yet. No, tonight holds a different kind of challenge. Navigating the intricate etiquette of the Victorian theatre, a mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, theatre outings were not merely about watching a play. They were social performances in their own right, as important for being seen as for seeing. For the fashionable classes, the theater box was as much a stage as the one with actors upon it. You arrive at the theater entrance, ticket in hand, aware that even the way you cross the threshold is noticed. The quirky tidbit: it was considered bad form to arrive too early. Fashionable people were meant to appear at the last moment, creating a small stir as they took their seats. Yet, arriving too late could mean missing the first act, which was seen as disrespectful to the performers, and worse, disruptive to those already settled. It was a tightrope of timing, measured in minutes and glances. Historians still argue whether these rules were universally practiced, or just the fancy of upper-crust city playhouses. In smaller towns, punctuality was still a virtue, and nobody would dream of making a grand entrance during a particularly quiet scene. Your steps are soft on the plush carpeting as an usher leads you to your box. Removing your outer wrap is its own miniature ceremony. You must hand it gracefully to the attendant without tangling your skirts or letting the garment drag on the floor. You take your seat at the front of the box, gloves still on, opera glasses in your lap. Even the act of scanning the audience with those little brass lenses carries unspoken meaning. Too much interest in a particular box could be read as gossiping, while avoiding eye contact entirely might suggest insecurity. Once the performance begins, you keep your posture composed. Laughing too loudly is frowned upon, as is clapping at inappropriate moments, though the precise definition of inappropriate depends entirely on your social circle. Among the more bohemian crowd, enthusiastic outbursts are forgiven. In the stricter salons, applause must be delivered with almost military precision at scene breaks. Then there's the matter of intermission. This is the true social arena. You may step into the lobby to be seen, exchange pleasantries with acquaintances, or even discreetly visit another box if invited. But lingering too long away from your seat risks suggesting you care more for the chatter than the art. In some circles, that's acceptable, expected, even. In others, it marks you as a dilettante. The refreshment tables gleam with crystal and silver, offering ices, tea, and the occasional glass of sherry. You select something light, nothing that could spill and stain silk. The chatter around you is a careful blend of play commentary and social updates. The second act will be marvelous, I hear, followed seamlessly by "Did you see Lady Winslow's gown?" The theater is a place where gossip wears the thin mask of culture. When the bell chimes for the next act, you return promptly to your seat. Any delay now could result in the awkward shuffle past already seated patrons, forcing you to murmur apologies into a darkened room. That is a sin on par with dropping a heavy lorgnette from the balcony, memorable, and not in a good way. The final curtain falls, and applause ripples through the hall like warm rain. You join in with poise, neither the first nor the last to stop clapping, and rise to leave in unhurried order. The street outside is cool now, the gaslight soft on the wet stones. The performance has ended, but the evening's work, your careful adherence to a labyrinth of tiny, invisible rules, feels almost as exhausting as if you had been the one on stage. The street is hushed now, the clip-clop of horses fading as you make your way home from the theater. Yet even in these dim, quieter hours, the world of etiquette doesn't sleep. No, the Victorian home itself was an arena of invisible rules, each one quietly patrolling the borders between propriety and scandal. And tonight, you're about to step into one of the trickiest of those borders, the unspoken code of guest bedrooms, a mainstream historical fact. In the Victorian era, a well-appointed home was expected to keep at least one guest room ready at all times. For middle-class households, this was a point of pride, a sign that you were capable of offering hospitality without scrambling. In grander homes, guest suites could be almost as lavish as the master chambers, with their own fireplaces, wardrobes, and even private washstands with pitchers of warm water, refreshed several times a day. You cross the threshold into your home and pause at the base of the grand staircase. Somewhere above, your guest for the evening, a distant cousin, or perhaps an old school friend, is settling into a chamber you've had prepared since midday. The quirky tidbit: Victorian etiquette manuals advised that the bed be turned down before asterisk dinner, but not too early, lest the sheets lose their freshly aired scent. Servants sometimes warmed the bed with brass pans filled with hot coals, slipping them between the sheets until the linen was almost toasty. Too toasty, sometimes, enough to make you wonder if anyone ever slept through the night without waking in a sweat. Historians still argue whether these warming pans were primarily about comfort or about demonstrating one's status through meticulous hospitality. After all, heating a bed required both staff and fuel luxuries not everyone could afford in quantity. You ascend the stairs slowly, the carpet soft underfoot, and pause outside the guest chamber. Even the act of entering is bound by quiet courtesies. You knock softly before pushing the door open, not because you expect your guest to be indecent, but because privacy is part of the performance. Inside, the fire has been lit, its glow painting the wallpaper with amber light. A porcelain pitcher and matching basin wait on the washstand, flanked by neatly folded towels. There's more to this than mere aesthetics. The arrangement of objects is a kind of silent choreography. The water pitcher on the right side of the basin, if the guest is right-handed. A small chair placed near the hearth for easy warming. Slippers discreetly tucked just under the edge of the bed. Even the choice of reading material matters. A volume of poetry might suggest you believe your guest refined, while a collection of light sketches could imply you know they prefer amusement to introspection. You leave the room quietly, knowing your role as host is not to hover, but to anticipate. Downstairs, supper has been laid out. Conversation at this hour is meant to be soothing, never pressing, never controversial. Politics and finance are for earlier in the day now. You discuss the weather in the Lake District, or the novelty of electric lighting in certain neighborhoods. Your guest sips tea, perhaps unaware of how carefully you've arranged their comfort. That's the point. If they see the machinery, the spell is broken. Later, you escort them back upstairs, carrying a candle in a glass shade to protect the flame from drafts. In the hallway, you wish them good night, careful not to linger too long at the door. A good host provides rest, not intrusion. Behind them, the bed waits, warmed and smoothed, the curtains drawn against the night. In a few hours, the servants will be up again, quietly tending the hearth so that your guest wakes to warmth and light. And so, even as you retreat to your own chamber, you know the etiquette continues without you, played out in the silence of a well-made bed. And the small kindnesses that speak louder than words. The clock's hands inch toward the half-hour mark, and though the laughter in the parlor is still warm, and the lamplight makes the room a soft amber, you can feel it, that slight tightening in the host's smile, the imperceptible way conversation begins to coil inward rather than unfold. In Victorian society, the art of departure is as intricate as the art of arrival, and you are about to perform it with the same precision you've applied to every other moment this evening. Staying too long marks you as presumptuous. perhaps even socially tone deaf. Leaving too soon could brand you cold or disinterested. You must gauge the temperature of the room with the skill of a barometer, reading not only your host's cues, but the silent choreography of other guests. A mainstream historical fact here: in upper and middle-class Victorian homes, evening visits were often strictly timed, 15 minutes for a casual call, perhaps up to an hour for a planned evening engagement, unless you were among the most intimate friends of the household. This wasn't rudeness. It was a reflection of a culture obsessed with measured propriety, where every action had its socially sanctioned slot. You adjust the fold of your gloves, not because they need straightening, but because the movement signals a shift, subtle, but recognized by those fluent in the language of leaving. A quirky tidbit: some etiquette manuals of the time advised guests to begin small physical cues of departure, up to 10 minutes before actually leaving, so as not to create an abrupt break in the mood. Straightening gloves, resting your hands on your lap instead of the armrest, allowing your gaze to drift toward the mantel clock. These were all micro signals, the Victorian equivalent of closing your tab at a modern bar without announcing it outright. Historians still argue whether such meticulous guidance was universally followed, or if it was an exaggerated invention of etiquette authors attempting to codify a more fluid social instinct. Either way, here you are, slipping into the role. Your host catches your eye, holding it just long enough to acknowledge your readiness to leave. This is your cue, the silent consent. You lean forward slightly, hands folded, and let a soft smile play across your face. Words matter here, not too many, and none that suggest dissatisfaction with the evening. You might say, "I fear I must not trespass on your hospitality any longer." Or, if you wish to sound especially polished, "You have been most generous with your time, but I must bid you good night." The language of parting is almost a spell, closing the evening in a tone that leaves the host feeling appreciated rather than relieved. The standing is part of the ritual. You rise slowly, not with the energy of a person eager to escape, but with the grace of one reluctant to leave a warm hearth. If you've been seated far from the door, you do not stride directly toward it. That would jar the pacing. Instead, you make your way toward the host, perhaps pausing to admire a framed lithograph on the wall, or to thank another guest for their company. This is not stalling. It is smoothing the edges of the departure, ensuring no one feels suddenly abandoned. You reach your host, and here the goodbye takes its most formal form. If you are of similar social standing and the relationship is friendly, a handshake or a gloved hand press may be exchanged. If the host is of higher rank, you wait for them to extend the gesture first. A lady might offer only her fingertips for a light clasp. A gentleman might bow his head slightly, careful not to overdo it. In some cases, particularly among close family or lifelong friends, a brief kiss on the cheek is permitted. But this is rare in public gatherings. You offer thanks again, always framing it as gratitude for the host's time and company, rather than for the food. or the entertainment specifically, because in Victorian thinking, you are thanking them for the entire experience of their hospitality. Coats or cloaks are involved. You do not retrieve yours yourself unless the gathering is extremely informal. A servant brings it, or the host's family member assists. You stand patiently, allowing them to arrange it properly on your shoulders. Here, another curious quirk. Some etiquette writers insisted that a guest should never fumble with their own buttons or ties until they were outside the host's front door. The reasoning being that adjusting your garments in their hallway suggested impatience to be gone. Whether everyone observed this or not, you decide to follow the rule. It feels cleaner somehow, as though you're not letting the machinery of leaving show too much. The final words are important, and they happen in the doorway. You might offer a variation of "I look forward to the next occasion," or "You must allow me to return the kindness soon." Promises of reciprocation are part of the Victorian glue that holds social networks together. Each visit is a thread, and the strength of the weave depends on the balance of giving and receiving. Declining to hint at a return call could be interpreted as a quiet severing of ties. If it's an evening gathering and the streets are dark, a gentleman host might offer to walk a lady guest to her carriage, or even to her home if the distance is not too great. In this, the host must balance courtesy with propriety. Offering too forcefully might suggest impropriety. Offering too little might be seen as neglectful. Tonight, the offer is made and politely declined. Your carriage waits at the curb, its oil lamps glowing faintly in the cool night. Stepping outside, you inhale the crisp air. There is a peculiar satisfaction in a departure well executed, like finishing the last line of a neatly written letter without smudging the ink. Behind you, the door closes with a muted thud, the sound cushioned by heavy wood and good manners. Somewhere in the house, the host exhales, perhaps already moving to tidy the room for the next engagement, perhaps simply savoring a moment of quiet. As the carriage wheels begin to roll, you find yourself reflecting on the evening, not on the conversation topics or the flavor of the syllabub, but on the rhythm of the visit itself. Arrival, settling, sharing time, sensing the shift, initiating the farewell, and finally, stepping away. Every part was deliberate, and every part was meant to make both you and your host feel respected, valued, and in control of the social exchange. In the Victorian mind, this wasn't overthinking. It was simply good manners. After all, in an age where your reputation could be built or broken by whispers over tea, the way you leave a room might be remembered long after what you said in it. The street lamp light flickers across the glass as you ride home, and you realize that the choreography of parting isn't just about that night. It's a quiet investment in the next meeting, the next invitation, the next thread in the social fabric. In Victorian society, nothing was left to chance, not even the moment you step away into the night. Morning seeps into the house with the faint gray of dawn, filtering through damask curtains and warming the brass knobs of your wardrobe. You stir in your own bed, but it's not your rest that concerns you now. It's the art. Yes, art asterisk, of orchestrating a Victorian breakfast, a mainstream historical fact. In the mid to late 19th century, breakfast was far from the casual, grab a piece of toast affair we might imagine today. For the middle and upper classes, it was a deliberate performance, more intimate than dinner, but no less bound by rules. Guests were to be made comfortable, yes, but within a structure so rigid that one could almost hear the clink of etiquette in every porcelain cup. You descend the stairs in a robe of heavy wool, the morning air still cool against your skin. In the dining room, sunlight spills across the polished table, which has been set since before sunrise. The quirky tidbit: proper Victorian breakfast tables sometimes featured more silverware than a modern formal dinner. Fish knives, bread knives, individual butter spreaders, and long-handled spoons for oatmeal, all arranged with military precision. In homes without servants, these place settings were a daily labor that could take an hour or more to prepare. Historians still argue whether the full, hot English breakfast of eggs, bacon, sausages, and kippers was truly the norm for most Victorians, or whether it was more an aspirational ideal seen in etiquette books and among wealthier families. In many modest households, breakfast might be tea, bread, and perhaps a slice of cold meat left over from the previous day. Your guest arrives, perhaps a touch hesitant, unsure whether to greet you immediately or wait for you to make the first move. That's the unspoken rule. In a well-run Victorian household, the host signals when the meal begins, even if the food has already been served on sideboards. You offer a pleasant good morning and invite them to the table. Tea is poured first, never coffee, unless the guest has expressed a preference. The teapot, swaddled in a quilted cozy, steams gently as amber liquid fills delicate china cups. You pass the sugar tongs, careful not to let them clink against the rim of the bowl. Then the toast rack arrives, its neat slices cooling just enough to preserve their crispness. Toast, the Victorians believed, should never be soggy. You watch as your guest hesitates over the kedgeree, a spiced rice dish with flaked fish and hard-boiled eggs. To you, it's a familiar morning staple. To them, perhaps, a mystery. You offer a gentle description without making it a sales pitch. In this era, guests were not pressured to try everything, merely provided with the opportunity. Servants move quietly through the room, clearing plates between courses. The hum of conversation rises just enough to fill the space without competing with the clatter of cutlery. You keep topics light but engaging. The day's plans, the quality of the marmalade, the faint rumor that the baker has started using imported flour from Canada. In Victorian dining, even gossip about bread could be a safe conversational anchor. By the time the final dish, perhaps a soft-boiled egg served in a porcelain cup, has been finished, the table looks as though it were never used. Linens are spotless, silver polished, crumbs discreetly whisked away. You and your guest rise together, the meal ending as gracefully as it began. It's only breakfast, yes. But here, in this world of manners and ritual, even the first meal of the day is a stage, and every movement upon it, yours and theirs alike, is part of a carefully written script. The night air drifts in, cool and steady. You hear the faint hum of that imagined fan you switched on earlier, a low, soothing undercurrent beneath the quiet. Each breath is slower than the last, each exhale longer, softer, pulling you further from the bustle of parlors and promenades. The heavy curtains of the century draw closed behind you, and the images blur, lace gloves melting into shadow, candle flames folding into darkness. All that's left is the steady rhythm of your own breathing, the gentle sense that time has slowed to match it. You've survived the strangest rules of another age, and now you're free to drift into the gentlest rule of all rest, without expectation. So close your eyes, let the night hold you, and slip quietly into dreams.